All right, let's plunge into the world of moral philosophy today, taking a deep dive into moral non-naturalism.
Sounds intriguing.
It is really. It's this idea that moral properties, things like good and bad, right and wrong, they exist, but they're not like, the things science typically studies.
Not like gravity or atoms, right?
Exactly. Not out there in the physical world in quite the same way.
So where are they then? What makes them different?
Well, that's the big question, and it's not some fringe theory either. This idea has roots going way back, especially with a philosopher named G.E. Moore. He was a big deal in 20th century ethics.
Ah, more. Principia Ethica, a real game changer.
Right. He really shook things up. His main point was that moral properties are what he called sui generis.
Latin for of its own kind, meaning goodness, can't be boiled down to anything simpler.
You got it. You can't just point to, say, pleasure or happiness and say, there, that's goodness.
Like defining water as H2O, you can't break down goodness into neat little components.
Exactly. And that's where Moore's famous naturalistic fallacy comes in.
He accused a lot of philosophers of making this error, trying to equate good with some natural property.
So if someone said good just means whatever helps humans thrive.
Moore would say, hold on, you're assuming thriving is inherently good. That's what needs proving.
So it's like saying a healthy meal is one that nourishes the body. Well, yeah, but that's just defining healthy with another word.
You're not actually saying why nourishment is a good thing in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. Avoiding circular reasoning and all. But then how do we know what's good if it's not tied to something concrete, like pleasure or well-being?
The million-dollar question, Moore's answer, and it's still debated like crazy, is that we grasp moral properties through intuition.
Intuition, so we just feel it.
Well, it's a bit more than a gut feeling. Think of it as a capacity we have for recognizing moral truths, kind of like how we perceive colors or shapes.
Okay, so like if I see someone being bullied, I don't need a scientific study to tell me that's wrong,
Huh,
right? It just feels wrong.
perfect example. Now, of course, this opens up a ton of new questions.
Like, how reliable is intuition? Does it differ between people? Do we all have the same ability to perceive moral stuff?
All valid challenges. We'll get into those for sure. But for now, the core of intuitionism is this. We access moral truths in a way that goes beyond just looking at the natural world.
It's like saying there's this whole realm of moral reality separate from the physical one, and we've got this special sense for tapping into it.
Exactly. And this leads us to one of the most fascinating and maybe frustrating parts of moral non-naturalism. How do these non-natural properties actually affect our actions in the real world?
Right. If they're not part of the physical world, how can they make us do anything? It's a real head scratcher.
This is what philosophers call explanatory impotence.
Sounds serious.
Well, the critics of non-naturalism say if moral properties don't cause anything, then they're useless for explaining how people act.
So, saying he gave to charity because he's a good person, that's not a real explanation, just a label.
You're catching on quickly. Exactly. Critics would say we explain things like giving to charity by looking at someone's past, how empathetic they are, societal influences, all those natural factors.
So where do these mysterious moral properties fit in then? What work are they really doing?
Good question. Non-naturalists have definitely thought this through. One response is, even if moral properties don't directly cause our actions in a simple way, they're still vital for our moral reasoning and judgment.
So it's less about a force making us act and more about how we understand the world, our place in it.
Exactly. When you're figuring out the right thing to do, you're not just weighing physical facts, right? You're thinking about reasons, values, principles, stuff that seems to go beyond just the natural.
I see. It's like me donating to charity. It's not just neurons firing in my brain. It's my beliefs about fairness, compassion, my sense of duty to others.
Exactly. And non-naturalists would say those beliefs, those values, they come from non-natural moral properties.
But how do those properties then connect to our natural motivations? That part still seems fuzzy.
It is tricky. Some non-naturalists say moral properties have a kind of magnetism, not a literal force, but a way of pulling us towards the good, pushing us from the bad.
Interesting. So not cause and effect, but like a moral pull on our desires or inclinations.
You got it. Now, another challenge for non-naturalism is this thing called supervenience. It gets a bit technical, but super important.
All right, lay it on me. I'm ready for the technical stuff.
So supervenience means moral properties depend on natural ones. You can't have a change in moral facts without a change in the natural facts. Think of a painting, and its brushstrokes can't change how the painting looks without changing the strokes, right?
Okay, let me try that with a moral example. Say, Lying to a friend. That lie's wrongness depends on the facts, the words, the intent, the relationship. But you couldn't have those same facts and the lie be okay.
Perfect example. That's why supervenience is a problem for non-naturalists. If moral properties are totally separate from natural ones, how can they be so connected? If they're in their own realm, how are they so sensitive to the natural world's happenings?
Yeah, it's like if they're off in some non-natural dimension, how are they tethered to the world of atoms and all that?
Right. Non-naturalists have a few ways to tackle this. Some say supervenience is just a brute fact, a fundamental thing about how moral and natural relate, even if we don't get why.
Like, that's just how it is, folks. Deal with it.
Well, it's more nuanced. They might say our very concept of morality is bound up with how we understand the natural world. We can't even think of moral properties without thinking about beings and actions.
So it's built into how we think, how we talk about morality. It's not that moral properties magically follow natural ones, but that they can't be separated conceptually.
Precisely. Others draw a parallel to the mind-body problem. We know thoughts depend on our brains, but the how is still a mystery.
So maybe it's similar with moral and natural properties. We don't have all the answers, but that doesn't mean the connection's not real.
You got it. Now, even with these attempts to square non-naturalism with supervenience, some philosophers say it points towards naturalism after all.
Because if they're so linked, why not just say they're the same thing?
Exactly. Naturalists say supervenience best explains why moral and natural facts line up so well. Simple, elegant solution, they'd argue.
Okay, so we've got this back and forth, each side trying to make sense of supervenience. So where does this leave us? What does all this mean for how we actually live?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's what makes moral philosophy so interesting, so relevant. Whether you're team non-naturalism or naturalism, this whole debate pushes us to think hard about what morality is, the limits of our knowledge, how we understand ourselves in this universe.
Feels like we've been digging deep, huh, into this whole moral philosophy mountain.
We have, haven't we?
Explored those peaks and valleys of moral non-naturalism, from Moore's big ideas to that whole supervenience stance.
Lots to unpack there.
But where does it all leave us? Is this just an intellectual game, or does it actually affect how we live, how we see morality in the real world?
Such a good question, and one that's kept philosophers busy for ages, I'd say. I think moral philosophy, when it's done right, it's not just about theories. It's about figuring out what truly matters, how we can live according to those values we find.
So less about winning arguments, more about using these ideas as a guide for our actions, our choices.
Exactly. Now, whether someone ends up on the non-naturalism side or leans towards naturalism, wrestling with these views can really change how you see the world.
Give me some examples how this might play out day to day.
Sure. Take environmental ethics. A non-naturalist might say nature has intrinsic value, like a goodness that's just there, not because it's useful to us. This might lead them to push for strong environmental protections, even if it costs us economically.
So not just weighing pros and cons, but recognizing a duty to protect something valuable in itself.
Exactly. A naturalist might come at it differently, focusing on how environmental damage hurts humans in the long run. They might reach the same conclusion about protecting the environment, but the reasoning's different.
That's so interesting. Even if people agree on what to do, the way they get there tells us about their moral compass.
Precisely. And this applies beyond the environment. Think about animal rights, artificial intelligence, even wealth distribution. Non-naturalism versus naturalism gives you different lenses to view these issues, to understand the values involved, how to justify moral claims.
Like having two toolboxes for ethical dilemmas, each with its own strengths and limits.
Great analogy. And studying moral philosophy, I think it helps us sharpen those tools, become more aware of our own biases, what we take for granted.
So it's not about finding the one right answer, but becoming more careful, more thoughtful in our moral reasoning.
You got it. Now, before we finish this deep dive, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier, how moral philosophy can be humbling.
I remember that. What did you mean by that?
Well, when we dive into these tough questions about good and bad, right and wrong, we're facing the limits of what we know. We realize morality might be way more complex, more mysterious than we first thought.
Like looking at a vast unknown land and realizing we've only just started to peek around the edges.
Exactly. For some, that's scary, uncertain. But for others, it sparks curiosity, excitement.
Definitely team curiosity here. This whole conversation has really stretched my brain, opened up new ways of thinking.
That's great to hear. And that's what moral philosophy should do, make us keep asking, keep searching, keep the conversation alive.
So for our listeners who've joined us on this philosophical journey, what's one key thing you want them to take away?
I'd say this. Whether you're drawn to non-naturalism or naturalism, the fact that we're even pondering these questions shows how much we as humans want to understand morality, to live a life true to our values.
Powerful stuff. And for those who want to explore more, we've got book suggestions and other resources in the show notes.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep those philosophical wheels turning.